What we call the Donner Party consisted of the two Donner families, the James Reed family, several other families who joined up with them along the trail, and a number of hired teamsters and single men making the journey west, altogether numbering 89 people. And because of all their heavy wagons and kids and animals and everything, they generally only covered about 15 to 20 miles per day. So the journey was slow going. Here in my modern wagon, I can cover a lot more ground. But, just like the pioneers, I plan to camp out along the way, sleeping in the back of my car. Okay, it's day 2 of my Donner Party expedition, and I made camp last night here in Marysville, Kansas, an unbelievably picturesque little town that inexplicably allows free camping in the town park. I mean, really? I didn't even know towns like this actually existed. There's even free electrical hookups, free drinking water, and flush toilets. Amazing! Of course, back in the pioneer days, there was no electricity and no toilets. If you think about it, they must have just pooped and peed wherever they could along the way. I don't know if they actually dug latrines or just went in the bushes. And apologies if you think this is kind of gross to talk about, but I think it's kind of important. I mean, imagine a wagon train of 300 wagons, basically a rolling city. That's going to create a significant amount of human waste. No wonder they were always dying of dysentery. I'm guessing sanitation was probably pretty poor. I mean, even just trying to stay clean. This was way before baby wipes, and this was way before Kotex, okay? Imagine all these poor women having to deal with having their periods on the trail. Remember, this was a journey that took between 5 and 6 months. Ugh. Anyway, I covered about 165 miles on my first day of travel, and the landscape was absolutely gorgeous. Gently rolling prairie covered in lush green grass. It was so beautiful. I'm sure many of the pioneers would have been happy to just stop right there and settle down. But at that time, this was still Indian territory and wasn't open to homesteading, so they had to continue on. All the free land was farther west. In any event, it must have made for fairly easy traveling. I mean, it's plenty of food and water for the animals, and no real hills or mountains to climb. Still, it took the Donner Party 2 weeks to cover what I did in a few hours. And they didn't get here to the banks of the Big Blue River until May 26th. When they got here, the river was too high to cross, so they had to camp out at a place called Alcove Spring and waste a few precious days building rafts to get their wagons across. Can you imagine? They chopped down trees and made friggin' rafts to strap their wagons to and get them to the other side. Remember how I said these people were hardcore? Speaking of hardcore though, look at me. I wanted to get to the banks of this river to shoot that, shot of the river going by, and I guess it's rained here a lot lately, so the trail is just completely covered in mud. It's not every day you get to walk in thick, ooey gooey mud this deep. Kind of the color and the consistency of dookie. Well, I'm camping. I don't have access to a shower, but I figure I can wash my feet off over at Alcove Spring. Ah, much better. See, who says you need a shower? The pioneers didn't have any showers. In fact, if they took a bath at all, they probably did just exactly what I just did. Wade in a creek. Anyway, the creek I washed my feet in flows out of what the Donner Party called Alcove Spring, where they camped for a few days while building the rafts to get their wagons across the river. And check it out, you can even still see here on this rock where James Reed carved his name. Remember, the Reed family was the kind of pretentious rich family. Well, look, you can still see it in the rock. That's pretty crazy. James F. Reed, 26 May, 1846. How friggin' cool is that? I guess he had plenty of time to sit around with a chisel while they were working on the rafts. Besides making the rafts, though, there was another reason they spent a few extra days at Alcove Springs. The Donner Party had suffered its first fatality. Sarah Keyes, the mother of James Reed's wife, Margaret. She was already sick. She had what they called consumption, tuberculosis, so it wasn't a surprise, but being good Christians, they had to take another day off to make her a coffin and give her a proper burial. This was definitely not the original headstone they made for her. This was put here by the Daughters of the American Revolution. I guess it's like a women's group that goes around putting up monuments for anyone affiliated with the American War for Independence. And I guess Sarah Keyes, she was born in 1776, okay, and then I guess her dad was somebody who fought in the Revolutionary War. So the Daughters of the Revolutionary War put this substantial gravestone up for her. I'm sure the Donner Party, if anything, maybe managed like a wooden cross. Anyway, it's really cool that they have all the stuff preserved at this little park outside Marysville. And if you look, you can even kind of see the ruts from all those wagons back in the day. It's very faint. You can kind of see indentations in the grass over there. I mean, I know there's some lines from a lawnmower, but that's not what I'm talking about. It's hard to see them in this light. But it's a trip. Well, when you think about all those thousands of wagons that pass through here, it stands to reason there'd be some markings left from them. I think there's supposed to be some even better wagon ruts, or they call them swales, S-W-A-L-E, a swale. Anyways, there's supposed to be some better wagon swales the farther west you go, like when you get into the desert and the ground is more hard packed and they don't get as much rain. So, looking forward to seeing that. Anyhow, what with all the raft building and coffin making and the burial of Sarah Keyes, the Donner Party didn't end up getting across the Big Blue River until May 31st. And the clock was ticking. Crossing the Big Blue was the first major obstacle westward bound immigrants had to face. But after that, the landscape became pretty chill. Anyway, it's day 3 of my trip. I covered 320 miles yesterday and camped here at this reservoir near where the Donner Party crossed the North Fork of the Platte River on June 17th. That's right, it took them 17 days to travel what I did in one afternoon. It's especially easy nowadays. Interstate 80 more or less follows the same route the wagon trail did, so you can blow along at 75 miles an hour, but still see much of the same scenery the pioneers did. What's really cool to me, and what was probably pretty interesting to the pioneers, is that by the time you get to western Nebraska, you can really see the landscape starting to change. I've been traveling around the Midwest for a couple weeks now, and I'm starting to get kind of homesick for the desert. And then today I saw this cactus at my campsite and I got all excited. This is the first cactus I've seen in a long time. And it would have been the first cactus most of the Donner Party had ever seen. It must have looked totally bizarre to them. To me, it just reminds me of home, but to them, it must have seemed totally foreign. A sign that they really were leaving behind the world they knew. It must have been exciting, but also kind of scary. Back then, they would have seen different animals too, like buffalo. This was back when buffalo were just roaming around wild. And not only did they occasionally hunt a buffalo for meat, they also used the dried buffalo dung as firewood, especially once they got out on the plains where there aren't many trees to cut down and burn. I mean, think about that too. Not only do you have a huge group of people rolling along, pooping everywhere they go, but they're also cutting down all the trees for firewood, and their livestock are eating all the grass. No wonder the Indians were pissed. Anyway, the Donner Party spent the rest of June crossing the plains. It was probably kind of monotonous after a while, after the initial excitement of being on the trail wore off. Day after day of prairie, day after day of waking before dawn, making a fire, making coffee, making breakfast, rounding up the animals, hitching the oxen, and then walking all day long. They would stop for lunch around noon. In fact, they called it nooning, but not for very long. And then it was back on the trail, mile after mile, all the way across the plains. If you've ever driven across Nebraska, you know how endless it seems. Well, now imagine walking it. The next few hundred miles passed pretty uneventfully for the Donner Party, following the course of the Platte River as it winds northwest through Nebraska. The whole wagon trail basically follows the course of one river or another pretty much along the entire route, since the settlers had to think about feeding and watering their livestock, which isn't an issue in this part of the country, but it would become a huge concern once they got to the desert. At least now, the farther west they got, they started to see famous landmarks that were mentioned in the guidebooks and by previous travelers. So they knew they were on the right path, and they knew they were getting closer. Like Courthouse Rock. I guess it looks like a courthouse. Chimney Rock. Looks like a nipple. And Scotts Bluff. Remember, these settlers were mostly from the eastern U.S., where there aren't all these crazy geologic formations like you see out west. So this stuff must have seemed really far out. Don't bury me on this prairie, take me where the cement grows. Let's move down to some big town where they love a gal by the cut of her clothes, and I'll stand out in buttons and bows. I'll love you in buckskin and skirts that I've homespun, but I'll love ya longer, stronger, where your friends don't tote a gun. My bones denounce the buckboard bounce and the cactus hurts my toes. Let's vamoose where gals keep using those silks and satins and linens that shows that I'm all yours in buttons and bows. Give me stern Sherman where women are women in high silk hose and peekaboo clothes and French perfume that rocks the room, and I'm all yours in buttons and bows. Buttons and bows. Buttons and bows. They must have been feeling pretty good at this point. Up till now, the journey had been pretty easy, and they were making good time. They were still behind schedule about a week or so, but they weren't worried. They'd made up some time crossing the plains, and besides, they had what they thought was an ace in the hole. All winter long prior to the trip, James Reed, the guy who carved his initials in that rock at Alcove Spring and who had the double-decker wagon, well, he'd been reading this book called The Emigrant's Guide to Oregon and California, written by a dude named Lansford Hastings. Well, that book briefly mentioned a possible shortcut on the California Trail that could save travelers hundreds of miles and weeks of travel. Never mind that there was literally only one sentence describing this shortcut in the guidebook, and that no other wagon train had ever attempted it. And never mind the fact that Lansford Hastings was basically a shyster trying to lure cheap labor to California. James Reed was sold on taking the Hastings cutoff, which meant they had nothing to worry about, no matter how far behind they'd fallen. They were taking a shortcut. They had plenty of time.